So Kant on peace. It is well known that Kant argues against war and for peace, and that the highest political good and the ultimate end, peace is the ultimate end of law. In this talk, however, I would like to explore the question of why war was a problem for Kant in the first place, and why it can only be solved by a lasting peace. Kant's essay on perpetual peace is a philosophical outline of peace and proposes a way to achieve a lasting state of peace in the world. Kant's assessment of war is very clear. He sees it as a scourge of humanity. In Kant's time, wars were much more frequent than today. For example, countless wars of succession. And even Frederick the Great, who was admired by Kant, started the First Silesian War only after 6 months after his accession to the throne in 1740, followed shortly afterwards by the Second Silesian War, and then, of course, the 7 Years' War, which began in 1756. Therefore, one can say that wars were common back then, and an empiricist, for sure, it's a shortcut of an empiricist, what I say now, an empiricist would probably say, we have become accustomed to wars happening, so they objectively exist and they are not a problem. They are simply part of our experience. And bellicists might have said that wars are a great thing because they make it possible for a people to inscribe itself in world history. The fact that war is a problem for Kant can therefore be seen as requiring explanation. I would try to clarify why war is a problem for Kant and why only a lasting peace is the answer for this problem. First part. Kant's 1795 essay on perpetual peace was written in the historical context of the treaty of the so-called Separate Peace of Basel, which was concluded between France and Prussia during the War of the First Coalition. However, Kant must have been working on this peace essay before this state contract or state treaty was concluded, so it was probably not Kant's starting point. It is also interesting to note that Kant's treaty takes the exact form of such a peace treaty. It is made up of preliminary articles containing prohibitive and permissive laws, definitive articles containing the idea of republic, federalism, citizenship, international law, and world citizenship, and a so-called secret article, which also appears in the historical Basel Separate Peace Treaty between Prussia and France. However, as Kant's great humorous irony shows, it is precisely in this secret article that Kant opposes secret articles as a component of treaties, as treaties requires transparency. In such a draft published for the public with the intention of enlightenment, the article would not really have remained secret anyway. In any case, it is philosophically relevant and significant that Kant casts his theory of peace in the form of a peace treaty. It shows him to be contractualist of peace, not only of the social contract. For Kant, war is a specifically interpersonal political phenomenon of conflict, which he evaluates negatively and which belongs to the legal sphere of international law. It is the law that applies between different peoples. War, of course, is to be avoided in favor of peace. The saying, si vis pacem para bello, which probably goes back to the Roman military and war theorist Vegetius, and in the end you can find even in Plato, nomoi, nearly the same idea that you have to prepare war in order to construct peace. It is pure cynicism from Kant's point of view. For Kant, peace as the highest and ultimate purpose of all law and of all politics, peace as ultimate purpose of law cannot be achieved by immoral means, namely war. For Kant, a mere silence of weapons is not peace. The state of war does not only refer to actual conflicts fought out with armed force, but even the possibility of waging war is already a state of war for Kant. As long as war is even possible, it already exists. In this respect, Kant would have been very satisfied with our term of Cold War for the conflict between the Western powers and the Eastern Bloc in the second half of the 20th century. Kant adopted this very broad concept of war from Thomas Hobbes, who already advocated it in his Leviathan. However, war is a problem for Kant for very specific reasons that had not even been seen, let alone been reflected before him. The reasons for war as a problem are as follows. According to Kant, the state is founded by an implicit or explicit contract. In this respect of the transition from the pre-state natural state of man to the political state is formed by social contract. Kant is for sure contractualist. For Kant, however, law and contract have a difficult meaning than, for example, for Hobbes, Locke, or Rousseau, namely not a pragmatic or saving your life or taking care of the freedom to use your property like Locke, but an idealistic reason. The contract in general, and thus also the contract to the state, has the task of allowing the freedom of the parties of the contract to coexist in a coordinated manner, external freedom. The purpose of the state and the constitutional state in particular is therefore to protect the external freedom of its citizens. The protection of freedom which the citizens themselves establish by a contract as a coordinated coexistence of their freedoms consists in the fact that the freedom of one citizen may not interfere with the freedom of another citizen in an illegitimate and then illegal manner. The phrase that the freedom of one citizen finds its limit in the freedom of another captures this idea very clearly. If the essence of the state is to protect the freedom of its citizens, then a state that leads its citizens into a war in which they risk or lose their lives, and thus the basis of external freedom, is contrary to its own existence. A constitutional state that starts a war is a contradiction in itself, and that is why war is a problem for Kant. This does not only apply to the citizens of such a state. If the state that starts a war offensively does so with the intention of subjugating the opposing state, Russia, Ukraine, then it is also contradicting itself. For if the state starting the war were to win the war, the other citizens would become its own citizens at that moment, in the moment of winning the war. But it is not allowed to subjugate them any longer, because then it would again contradict its own nature as far as it is a republic. In this respect, wars of aggression per se cannot be legitimized for Kant. However, if we are dealing with a defensive war, the situation is different, because then the state's duty to defend the freedom of its citizens comes into play. If such a state were not to defend itself, but, for example, to cede territory through negotiations, keyword dictated peace, like we have today, some suggestions, it would not fulfill its own duty, this state. For Kant, war is therefore a problem because it violates the dignity of the citizens as ends in themselves. In a war, people are used as means. The term Kanonenfutter reveals this very clearly. However, the contract to the state is concluded by free subjects who must therefore never be treated merely as a means, but always also as an end. More precisely as an end in itself. And therefore, one can say with Kant, war is, in respect to politics and law, always an immoral thing, and per se there can not be a just or moral war of aggression, let alone a holy war. In such a war, holy war, God himself or herself, if he or she exists, would have to want people to be used as means in a holy war. Then God would be immoral. Second part. Finally, and briefly, let us briefly turn to the means that Kant recommends to make a war impossible. A distinction must be made here between concrete and long-term means. And for sure, the long-term means are also very concrete. Kant is not a dreamer in this regard. First, the concrete means. Kant explains these in the preliminary articles of his essay, as is well known. First, no deceptive peace agreements may be concluded that serve only to put one or both parties of the conflict in a better position for the next war. To use the time, for example, to rearm or upgrade, to repair military positions. We see this right now when there are peace negotiations in Israel-Palestine conflicts. Second, state territories may not be arbitrarily transferred between states by inheritance, exchange, purchase, or donation. And donation, if you think of the Krim, that was a donation from Russia to be so. And Kant says, nope. The citizens of the respective state territories are treated here only as bulk, which harbors future conflicts. 3. States must not maintain standing armies. 4. States must not become heavily indebted to other states, which is also the case right now. 5th, the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of other states must be observed. And 6th, in the event of hostilities between states, no confidence-breaking measures may be taken, such as the employment of assassins, poisoners, and traitors. Today we would understand this to mean the outlawing of chemical or biological weapons, for example. So you see it's a text for today, what Kant writes here. Of course, these concrete measures can only be seen as very problematic because it is of no use for a state that complies when it is surrounded by hostile powers. It would be easy prey. This brings us to Kant's long-term strategy. Here he relies on a global league of nations, or people, or states, a global league of nations, which is what our United Nations is today. Kant's idea is that states should gradually become republics. It is constitutional states in which there is a separation of powers, participation and representation of citizens, and only those laws may apply in a republic to which the subjects can agree, provided they use their own reason, and the law must apply equally and without exception to all. That's the core of Kant's idea of a republic. Such republics would not start a war because the citizens would have to freely and reasonably consent to it. Nowadays, the idea of Kant is reflected in the saying that democracies do not wage war against other democracies. And in fact, it can be observed empirically that it is authoritarian regimes and terrorist states or failed states that tend to start wars. Due to Kant's ambiguous statements, it is disputed in Kant research whether only states that are already republics may join Kant's Federalist League of states or nations, or whether absolutist states may also join the Federal Union. There are allusions to both, and if you think Kant further, somehow you can get to the position that only republics should be part of this league. But in the end, Kant agrees to the latter, that also non-republics can join. And of course, it is unrealistic to wait until all states are republican, constitutional states before beginning to install such a league. But as we see today, the United Nations is running into serious problems with states that are neither democratic nor truly republican, even if they have it in their title. especially if they are veto powers in the UN Security Council. In the meantime, democratic constitutional states are already in the minority in the United Nations compared to the undemocratic states. At one point, Kant argues in terms of power strategy and says that the Republican principle will prevail if a central power on a continent is already a republic and the Republican idea spreads from there. He was, of course, referring to France, but that is only obviously a posteriori argument, so it's a problem to deduce a priori that all states will be republics. Kant's idea of perpetual peace, therefore, remains a task for the United Nations, and therefore Kant's ideas are contemporary ideas. And thereby, since it is a task for the United Nations, it's a task for all of us. The human task of creating a just peace in which everyone can live their freedom in coordination with the freedom of others in accordance with the law and autonomously is not a utopian fantasy, but the only form in which people can exist in accordance with their dignity. Therefore, peace is a political duty. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rainer. In this short commentary, I want to present a broad outline of my PhD project because it is, as you can imagine, linked to what Rainer Schäfer just presented. And in this short time, I can't argue for that in extenso, of course. Instead, I will rather elaborate a little on my thesis. My project is not directly concerned with the legal mechanisms of establishing and securing an international peace order, but rather with the underlying principles of Kant's political thinking in general. Nevertheless, I want to at least motivate my thesis, starting from the core principle of the problem of war and peace. For Kant, the core principle of containing war is political integration by means of republicanism, which makes this integration possible on different levels. Firstly, the republic integrates its citizens on the basis of reciprocal freedom, equality, and dependence on a common legislation. Secondly, it integrates other republics by making wars between them less likely, because their citizens are held responsible for wars and their consequences. And thirdly, it lays the ground for the relation between citizens and other states, which are integrated in a cosmopolitan order of global hospitality. Now, the standard interpretation, and surely Kant's own focus, at least into perpetual peace on the common saying and the doctrine of right in the metaphysics of morals, lies on some kind of coercive force, which makes political integration binding. The basic principle of just coercion is a law that restricts my own actions to the limits of another person's external freedom. That coercion, without a doubt, is a condition of political integration becomes most obvious where an institution lacks the authority to enforce this kind of coercion, like in a federation of free states. However, it is rarely noticed that Kant provides at least a second model of political integration, which I am concerned with in my dissertation. You could call that model of integration a bottom-up model because it does not derive external freedom from metaphysical principles of right or moral law directly, but from a consensus that takes into account the intersubjective conditions of political integration. This consensus is not established by the autonomy and constraint of actions, but by the autonomy of judgment, more specifically aesthetically reflecting judgment. An aesthetic judgment is autonomous, as it is free of prejudice and independent of heterogeneous influences like institutional or moral force. We feel our freedom by judging aesthetically. On this basis, or more specifically on the basis of transcendental principles of aesthetic judgment, it can claim universal consent. In Kant's scholarship, it is widely acknowledged that especially the concept of Gemeinsinn or sensus communis provides the aesthetic consent with the social and civic dimension. So on this basis, I'm arguing that transcendental conditions of taste provide principles of free political integration, although it is important to mention that free integration is not an opposing concept to coercive integration, but rather a complement. Throughout Kant's works, and especially in the third critique, there are numerous passages, so not just the passages about the sensus communis, in which Kant applies the principle of taste and artistic production to a political context, or uses political issues as examples for inadequate or adequate taste. In this limited commentary, I just want to highlight a certain feature, namely of the sublime, that will be a minor point in my dissertation, but can provide a different angle on the problem of war and peace. My starting point is Kant's at first glance disturbing claim that a soldier or warfare, respectively, are sublime, if they are fought according to the laws of a bellum justum. The sublime is a mixed aesthetic feeling of negative pleasure, which is evoked by vast or violent phenomena. Facing these phenomena, we are in awe, shock, or horror, since our very natural existence is threatened. For example, by volcanic eruptions, thunderstorms, or, in the case of war, bombardment, explosions, etc. We find ourselves secure, if we find ourselves secure from these threats, we can distance ourselves from our fear and overcome it. This structure of overcoming our fear is an analogy to discipline our inclinations, which makes the feeling of the sublime affine to a moral feeling, so that we become aware that we are not exclusively embedded in nature, but rather have a rational power of creating a different, morally adequate nature. Kant's argument in the case of sublime war seems to be that the moral consciousness of a nation or a soldier, or a population or soldier facing the violence of war is emblematic for the rational power of fear, which evokes a sublime feeling. The condition being that they fight in the name of a civic order, that is, freedom, independence from an aggressor or oppressor, and so on. In this context, war has an ambivalent tendency. It is violent, chaotic, and purposeless, which makes it a case of the sublime. On the other hand, it is pictured as a means to establish a civic order, which makes sense of otherwise senseless events. This double tendency is paradigmatic for Kant's view of war in other contexts as well. In To Perpetual Peace, Kant claims that war has an, quote, inner dignity, because the braveness, end quote, because the braveness that comes with fighting evokes a notion of virtue. In Conflict of the Faculties, war is seen as a means to a civic society and a republican constitution, but still is the, quote, destroyer of all good, end quote. To understand this paradox, it is important to notice that war is not only evaluated from a legal, theoretical, or moral perspective, but also from a cultural and teleological perspective. From this latter perspective, you can, for example, distinguish short-term and long-term effects of war, so that a destructive war in a certain place and time can lead to peace treaties and peace-securing institutions in the long run. Now, this should make it easier to understand why war is discussed in the context of the sublime in the first place. In judging a sublime phenomenon, we gain an awareness of the continuity between present purposelessness and a practical purpose to which things should lead. And since this continuity does not rely on an arbitrary feeling, but is a priori based on the transcendental principles of aesthetic judgment, this moral purpose is not a guess, a wish, or an utopia, but a rational possibility with moral validity. One might object to this argument that where the horrors of war should be condemned and prevented in the first place, its violence is aesthetically and cynically excused. Why assign any meaning to war at all? In response, it can be said that the aesthetic judgment does not imply that the more dreadful and destructive a war is, the more clearly it would lead to a moral order. Just as the sublime feeling in the face of a volcanic eruption does not consider its violence itself to be morally beneficial, the sublime feeling does not say anything about the usefulness of war itself. The aesthetic consciousness of a moral purpose alone is not sufficient for the realization of a morally based peace art. It cannot simply be judged into existence through a merely contemplative attitude. Rather, the aesthetic evaluation of war should be understood as a diagnostic or hermeneutic attitude toward a teleological coherence of events, which have to be realized by actions of a morally determined will. As I stated at the beginning, this short commentary could only give, firstly, a very broad outline of my project, and secondly, a very specific perspective on the topic Rainer Schäfer presented. Nevertheless, I hope I could make a few points which show what I am working at the moment as part of this Kant-Zentrum, and that get the discussion started. Thank you very much.